Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday. For those who are tuning in live here in the US, it is nationally recognized as Thanksgiving Day by the majority of society. And then there's also today is the day of mourning for Indigenous who are indigenous to this country, which most of my heritage is not. So, welcome, and this is our Authentici-Tea talk for this Thursday. And what I would like to talk about today is privilege. I know, I am totally ready and preparing myself to get some flack on this video. I know that it's really uncomfortable to talk about privilege on a day like Thanksgiving when there's so many different opinions about Thanksgiving and celebrating and being thankful versus understanding what Thanksgiving means to Indigenous peoples, and it's a really big debate, at least in my circles recently. And so I understand that I may get some flack for this video, but that's okay. That's what it means to use your privilege to lift those that are less privileged. So I don't mind getting flack, and if you feel like I'm in the wrong or that you disagree with what I have to say, I encourage you to either comment live on this video or comment down below. The conversation can go nowhere if we're all censoring ourselves and not having the conversation. So feel free to join in. I've always kind of understood in some senses privilege because I grew up very white in a very white area. And I understand in basic concepts for most of my life, sort of what that meant. I also grew up incredibly underprivileged as a child and in pretty much the poorest conditions that are seen in the US. And so I understand what it means to be socioeconomically underprivileged. That doesn't necessarily mean I know what it means to be underprivileged in every way. And so I became more aware of what privilege is and what it isn't and how it functions in this country. Earlier this year, during the summer, I went to a symposium where a professor from the University of Oregon spoke, Johnny Lake, and he came and did a couple of talks on power and privilege. And he is a really amazing man. He introduced himself as, and hopefully I quote this correctly, a little black boy from Alabama who loves his grandma. And he's this 6'5", 50-something-year-old black man. And he's just got such an amazing perspective on privilege, obviously because being black, he has that understanding personally, but also he's committed his life to sociology and the understanding of all dynamics of privilege, including gender, skin color, which if you talk to him isn't about race, it's about culture, a slew of other forms of privilege. And I learned quite a bit from him coming to talk about this. And so I wanted to share some of those principles here with you because all of his talks, the couple I heard from him it just changed my perspective and really gave me a better understanding of how to be in the world. So one of the things that really hit me hard when Johnny Lake came to talk is about our ability that everybody has privilege. It's not just, we have this narrative in our society that it's just, white males or just white people that have privilege. And that's absolutely not true. And it doesn't mean that white people don't have privilege. We absolutely have the most privilege of any demographic around the world. But what we need to recognize is that everybody has privilege and everybody is underprivileged in certain ways. And the reason that this is important, as Johnny Lake told us, was because you can't understand how to extend your privilege until you understand what it means to be underprivileged. And for me in my work, that has come out the most in gender dynamics. So we see men, especially white men, as being very privileged, and even they themselves don't identify with being underprivileged. But they absolutely are. Men are absolutely underprivileged in emotional expression in the skills of communication and expression, in personal expression, and being able to choose gender identity. There's a slew of ways in which, if you look at men and women, and even bring in some of the non-binary gender expression, that men are extremely limited and underprivileged. And it's been my job to help men, and everybody in society, but men especially, understand this dynamic, because if they can really feel the pain of what it feels like to be underprivileged, then they can understand in what ways, how it feels to be underprivileged, and have empathy for those who are less privileged than them due to the sex that they were born with or the gender expression that they choose to express. So that was the first principle. You have to understand in what ways you're underprivileged in order to understand why privilege is important to extend. The second point being, privilege should be extended. Privilege is not necessarily a horrible thing by itself. It's unavoidable. We all have certain aspects of privilege. The point, though, is to not ignore your privilege. Willful ignorance, right? We talked a little bit about that yesterday. I have zero patience for willful ignorance. And that's what a lot of people from underprivileged demographics have issues with people that are in a pretty big place of privilege, is that the willful ignorance to extend that privilege. It's like, okay, no, I'm not privileged. Oh, let me ignore that issue. And then they're sitting with this golden ticket, essentially, in a lot of ways, that they're not extending to someone else to help them. And that's one of the points that Johnny Lake made, is that as a person of privilege, whether it's a man's privilege of safety in the world over a woman's, or a white person's sense of privilege over brown people, whether that be Black, Indigenous, etc., that the point of having that privilege is to extend that privilege. And so he gave the example of a woman that he works with. They were working late and she needed to leave and go to her car. And she asked him to walk her to her car. And he realized in that moment, oh, I have privilege over this woman. I don't have to worry much about violence between, this 100 feet I have to walk, but she absolutely does. And so I'll extend the protection of my privilege to her by walking her to her car. And so, the second principle I wanted to talk about today is in what ways we are recognizing our privilege and our underprivileged, but also in what ways are we extending that privilege to people that are underprivileged in order to provide them with protections in ways that we might have them and take for granted, or that may not be as hard for us. The third principle has to do with extending privilege. Something that he said that made a lot of sense to me is that privilege is only extendable to the point where you can reach, right? Like, if you reach your arms out, you can only help those that are within your ability to reach out. And so you can't necessarily, as let's say a white person in society, somebody identifying as Caucasian or white, you can't eradicate the suppression of Indigenous peoples by yourself, because your reach is not that far. You don't have that human ability. But what you can do is, a single white person walking down the road may be able to see a brown person being, questioned by police or being, harassed by other people, and stop and extend the privilege of them being white, just being present and making sure that your presence is there, providing some protection for that underprivileged person. And so, in what ways can we extend to our reach? And then for me, also, how can I extend my reach? That's part of the reason I'm here and I'm doing this work, is the more that I can get my ideas out there and the wider that ripple goes out, that's my reach, right? And I want to use my privilege as somebody who looks white and is perceived as Caucasian, even though I have a lot in my DNA. I want to extend that privilege through my platform, and my platform extends my reach. And I'm very aware of that. So, in what ways can we extend our privilege? In what ways can we extend our reach in order to extend our privilege? And what does that mean to the human body? What would it look like if we all really rooted into what are we privileged around and how are we underprivileged, and extend our privilege out of that place of empathy from understanding what it is to be underprivileged. And that can be expressed in lots of different ways. I know that several of my friends today, including myself, will be sitting down with our family and friends at our Thanksgiving, Friendsgiving, thankful time tonight, and giving rise to, or giving voice to, the struggles of Indigenous peoples. Because this idea of the Pilgrims and the Indians, natives, sitting down and having this glorious feast together and everybody's happy is a fantastic fairy tale. It's not that settlers and Indigenous peoples never sat down to eat a meal together. It's that fraction of the story is infinitesimal. The bigger fraction of the story is a trail of tears. It is the mass genocides of Native peoples. And Native peoples doesn't mean all the natives living within the boundaries of the United States. That's not true. That's a fallacy. There were hundreds of tribes that lived in this area. It wasn't one native people. It was the Kalapuya and the Sayusla Indians, and all of these different tribes of people that were systematically and willfully hurt and damaged and killed and put on reservations. This was a systemic effort to undermine Indigenous peoples. And we, as people of privilege, and myself as a white person, I want to know that I'm extending the privilege of being seeming white. I'm actually a pretty good fraction Blackfoot myself, but to seeming white, to give voice right now during this live stream, but also tonight. I will sit down with the people that I love and give to the Kalapuya Indians, natives who were sitting on this land and had this land for many, 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 many generations before white people came here. And the only reason I'm able to sit in this beautiful house on this beautiful land is because the Indigenous people were here first. And they cultivated this land, and it was through my white ancestors that this land came to be something that I could live in the way that I do. And there's nothing I can do to reach back into the past and change that, but what I can do is give rise to the issues of Indigenous people. So give nod to the natives that were here before white people were here, but also use this platform with me and you to say, let's be aware of our privilege. Let's be aware of the fact that in 2016, over 5,700, that's the size of a small town, worth of Native women were missing or murdered. And that number is only going up. Imagine if 5,700 white women went missing or were murdered mysteriously in 1 year. Imagine the outrage, imagine the outreach and the reaction from governments and communities. It would be epic. And it's just not happening. And it's because, by and large, due to guilt, due to shame, due to not wanting to look at colonial on native lands, we're ignoring issues for Indigenous people. And at the base, we're all humans. We're all pieces of the human body. And so each of us is just as important as every other. So today I want to use my privilege to extend it to Indigenous peoples in the best way that I can. And I hope that you too can take a look inside yourself and see in what ways you can extend your privilege to others, to give them voice, to give them life, to give them the awareness and just awareness and intentionality that they deserve within the human body. All right, that's it. I'm gonna get off my soapbox. Please let me know what you thought of this talk, what you think about privilege. If you agree or disagree, I want to hear all of that. And until tomorrow, stay authentic, everyone. Thanks for being here.